Her son Thomas had always been kind and gentle and perhaps a bit too trusting, and when he brought Natasha home 3 years ago, Eleanor had smiled and welcomed her, but something in the back of her mind whispered to wait and to watch and to understand who this young woman truly was before opening her heart completely. Natasha was lovely and poised, and she said all the right things at family dinners, and she never asked for anything extravagant, but Eleanor had seen too much in her long life to accept surfaces as truth, and she needed to know if her son had found genuine love or something else entirely. So Eleanor made a decision that some might call eccentric and others might call wise, and she would disguise herself and enter her son's life from a completely different angle, and she would see how Natasha treated someone who seemingly had nothing to offer and no power to grant favors or inheritance. On a cool autumn morning, Eleanor dressed in worn work clothes and borrowed a pink jacket from the donation pile at a charity she supported, and she applied makeup to age her face even more and to make herself unrecognizable, and she put on a pink cap and pulled her gray hair out in wisps, and she became Rose, and a woman who collected trash and recycled bottles to make ends meet. The neighborhood where Thomas and Natasha lived was one Eleanor knew well because she had purchased the building years ago as an investment, and Thomas lived there in a comfortable apartment, never knowing his mother owned the property, and now Rose would work these streets and see what she could see. That first morning Eleanor pushed her cart slowly down the sidewalk, and her back genuinely ached from bending, and she wondered if perhaps she was too old for such theater, but then she saw Natasha coming out of the building and looking fresh and beautiful in her green dress, and Eleanor's heart beat faster with anticipation and nervousness. Natasha walked past without a glance, and her phone pressed to her ear and her laughter bright and carefree, and Eleanor told herself this meant nothing because most people didn't notice street cleaners, and it was early still, and there would be other days and other chances to see the truth. Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor came faithfully to the neighborhood, and she picked up trash and sorted bottles, and she watched and she learned the rhythms of her son's life from the outside. And Thomas left early for his job at the hospital where he worked as a doctor, and Natasha's schedule was less predictable, and some days she was gone before noon and other days she stayed home until afternoon. Eleanor noticed other things too, and she saw how Natasha stopped to pet the neighbor's dog, and how she held doors for elderly residents, and how she greeted the mailman by name, and these were good signs and small kindnesses that suggested a decent heart. But Eleanor needed more, and she needed to see how Natasha would respond to someone like Rose, and someone invisible and powerless. The opportunity came on a gray morning in late October, and Eleanor was sorting through a recycling bin when her cart tipped over and bottles scattered everywhere and rolled across the sidewalk in a cascade of glass and plastic, and she let out a small cry, and more from frustration than pain, because her disguise made her feel vulnerable in ways she had forgotten. Natasha was coming down the steps of the building, and she had her purse over her shoulder, and she looked like she was heading somewhere important, but when she saw the fallen cart and the old woman struggling, she stopped, and without hesitation she set down her purse and she came over quickly. "Oh my goodness, let me help you," Natasha said, and her voice was warm and concerned, and she began gathering bottles, and she didn't flinch from the sticky residue or the smell, and she worked alongside Eleanor as if they were equals and friends. Eleanor stayed in character, and she mumbled thanks, and she let her hands shake a little as they worked, and she watched Natasha's face, and there was no impatience there and no disgust, and only genuine kindness, and the kind that comes from the heart and not from duty. "Are you all right?" Natasha asked, and she touched Eleanor's arm gently, and, "Did you hurt yourself when it fell?" No, I'm fine," Eleanor said, and she made her voice rough and tired, and, "Just clumsy these days, and getting old isn't for the faint of heart." Natasha smiled, and it reached her eyes, and, "My grandmother used to say the same thing," and she helped Eleanor right the cart, and she made sure everything was secure, and, "Do you work this route every day? I've seen you around." Eleanor's heart squeezed because Natasha had noticed, and when so many people looked right through the elderly and the poor and the invisible, this young woman had seen her. "Most days," Eleanor answered, "and, except Sundays, and these old bones need a day of rest." "I'm Natasha," she said, and she extended her hand, and when Eleanor shook it the grip was firm and respectful, and, "I live in this building, and if you ever need anything in water or a place to warm up, you can knock on apartment 3B. Over the following weeks something unexpected happened, and Eleanor found herself actually talking with Natasha, and not as a test or an investigation but as one human being to another, and Natasha would bring out coffee on cold mornings, and not expensive coffee but simple cups from her own pot, and she would stand and talk for a few minutes about nothing important, and the weather and the changing leaves and the way the city felt different in autumn. One morning Natasha came out looking troubled and her eyes red, and Eleanor asked if everything was all right, and for a moment she forgot she was supposed to be Rose and her maternal instinct broke through. "I'm okay," Natasha said, and she tried to smile, "and, Justin, my husband's mother, and we've never been close, and I think she doesn't approve of me, and I try so hard but nothing seems good enough." Eleanor felt her heart crack because she heard the pain in Natasha's voice and the genuine desire to be accepted and loved, and she realized with sudden clarity that her distance had hurt this kind young woman and had created doubt where there should have been welcome. Maybe she's just protective, Eleanor said softly, and sometimes people who love deeply are afraid to love again and afraid to let new people in because they've been hurt or disappointed before. Natasha wiped her eyes and, maybe, she said, but I wish she could see that I really love Thomas and not for his family's money or connections and just for him and for who he is. Eleanor nearly broke character right then, and she wanted to pull off the cap and the worn jacket and tell Natasha that she did see and that she understood now, but she held back because something told her this wasn't the moment yet. The next week Thomas came out with Natasha and Eleanor saw her son through new eyes, and he looked happy and healthy, and he held Natasha's hand with such tenderness that Eleanor felt tears threaten. Thomas stopped when he saw Rose, and Natasha had clearly told him about the older woman who cleaned their street, and, "Good morning," he said in his voice carrying his father's gentle tone, and, "Thank you for keeping our neighborhood so clean." He pulled out his wallet and handed Eleanor some bills, and it was more than necessary and far more than most people would give, and Eleanor saw where his kindness came from in the way Natasha squeezed his hand with pride, and she knew then that her son had chosen well and better than she had dared to hope. That evening Eleanor went home and removed her disguise, and she sat in her real apartment in her penthouse with its views of the city, and she thought about what she had learned, and it wasn't just that Natasha was kind to strangers, though that mattered, and it was that Natasha loved Thomas truly, and that she worried about belonging, and that she tried to be good even when she thought no one important was watching. The next Sunday Eleanor invited Thomas and Natasha to dinner, and she did this sometimes but always the atmosphere had been slightly formal and careful, and this time when they arrived Eleanor embraced Natasha and held her close and whispered, "I'm sorry I've been distant and I was afraid, but I see you now and I see your heart, and I'm so grateful my son found you." Natasha pulled back, surprised and confused and happy all at once, and, "Thank you," she said in her voice breaking, "and that means everything to me." Over dinner Eleanor told them a story, and not the whole truth perhaps but enough, and she talked about how sometimes we need to see people in different contexts to really understand them, and how wealth and family position can cloud our judgment, and how the measure of a person is in how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Thomas listened and held Natasha's hand across the table, and later as they were leaving he kissed his mother's cheek and, "I don't know what changed Mom," he said, "but thank you." Eleanor thought about Rose and the woman who would quietly retire from her route, and she thought about Natasha bringing coffee to a stranger and opening her home and sharing her worried heart, and she realized that the test had not been for Natasha alone, and it had been for Eleanor too, and a test of whether she could let go of control and fear and trust in the goodness she had raised in her son. "Sometimes we just need to pay attention," Eleanor said, and she smiled at them both, "and that's all, and just pay attention to what really matters." And what mattered was this, in love expressed in small kindnesses and coffee on cold mornings and helping gather spilled bottles and holding hands and building a life based on something real and something that would last long after money and property were forgotten. And that night Eleanor slept peacefully, and knowing that her son was truly loved and that she had almost missed it by looking for the wrong things, and in the end a pink jacket and a garbage cart had taught her what years of wealth could not, and that the heart reveals itself not in grand gestures but in quiet moments when no one important is supposed to be watching and everyone is.